Laura Bennett had spent 17 years in the HR department at Devlin Co. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't political. But she was known. Quiet competence had been her currency. People came to her when things fell apart, grievances, breakdowns, uncomfortable investigations, and Laura handled them with steady hands and a steady voice. But lately, the room had started to shift. It began with small things. Her name wasn't on the invite list for the monthly strategy meeting. When she asked about it, Greg, her new department head, smiled as if he were offering a favor. "Oh, we're just tightening up the group, Laura. You're over capacity already, right?" She wasn't. Then, 2 key files she'd been managing for over a decade were reassigned to streamline efficiency. They now sat on a junior associate's desk, someone with exactly 2 years of experience and a loud LinkedIn presence. Greg called it redistribution of bandwidth. Laura called it what it was, erasure in slow motion. At first, she tried to rationalize it. The company was changing. Maybe it was time to pass the baton. But that didn't explain why her name disappeared from the org chart within a week. Or why she suddenly had to ask for access to documents she had created. By the 3rd week, her office had been moved from the 6th-floor glass hallway to a windowless cubicle near the copier. Greg didn't even look her in the eye when he broke the news. "This'll be better for collaboration," he said, waving vaguely toward the open workspace. "More energy. More synergy." What he meant was, "You don't belong here anymore. But we're not going to fire you, not yet. We'll just move the walls in until you disappear." Laura stood in her new space that first morning and stared at the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Her framed diploma from Stanford rested in a cardboard box under her desk, next to a half-dead plant and a mug no one had noticed missing. It wasn't rage she felt. Not yet. It was confusion. Disorientation. And something colder, a creeping realization that she was being rewritten. Not just removed from meetings, but from memory. From the institutional story she had helped build. That week, she noticed Greg was CCing her less. Emails she would have been looped into by default now landed somewhere else. Her suggestions in team meetings were met with polite nods and then ignored entirely. New hires began arriving without her input, an unthinkable shift for someone who had once shaped entire hiring pipelines. The final push came during a quarterly review meeting. Greg stood at the front of the conference room, surrounded by younger managers, clicker in hand. His PowerPoint slid through the usual corporate buzzwords until one line made Laura's stomach twist. "Next quarter," he said, "we'll be auditing all legacy HR processes. It's time to modernize and eliminate outdated frameworks." The word legacy hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what it meant. Old. Obsolete. Unnecessary. Laura kept her face still. But inside, the puzzle pieces were locking together. This wasn't oversight. It was strategy. And she wasn't a person in the way, she was a liability being managed out quietly. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the house quiet except for the tick of the wall clock. She held her tea with both hands, staring at the email she had written but not yet sent. Subject line: concerns about organizational changes. Her cursor blinked at the end of the second paragraph. She had listed the meetings missed, the projects reassigned, the team realignments. All the facts were there. But something stopped her. Because she knew how this would go. She had written the protocols, after all. Raise concerns too early, and you're labeled difficult. Wait too long, and you're told you should have spoken up. Complain the wrong way, and they start documenting your negativity. The system she had spent her life helping to maintain was now turning its gaze toward her. Laura closed the laptop. She wouldn't send the email. Not yet. Instead, she pulled out a notebook from her bag, the kind with a hard black cover and thick ivory pages. She wrote down the names, dates, project titles. Who had said what? Who had started to vanish before her? It was the first entry in what would become her quiet rebellion. Not with rage. Not with confrontation. With observation. With precision. With proof. And in the stillness of her kitchen, Laura finally stopped waiting for someone to give her a voice. She was going to write her own. For the first time in years, Laura stopped raising her hand in meetings. She stopped offering insights, stopped staying late to fix broken workflows, stopped being the one who remembered birthdays or noticed when someone cried in the bathroom after a performance review. Let them notice the gaps she once quietly filled. Let them wonder why things weren't working like they used to. She wasn't being petty. She was being deliberate. Laura knew the system better than anyone, where it was weakest, where the shortcuts were hidden, where the violations lived buried in spreadsheets and HR software no one outside her old team ever checked. Her replacement, a 29-year-old with a background in people ops, had access to the tools but not the history. He had charm, a podcast, and zero clue about how many NDAs the company had buried over the last decade. She did. The quiet game began with observation. Laura started downloading internal memos from the shared drive, communications about layoffs labeled strategic reallocation, performance reviews quietly altered to justify terminations, salary gap audits that were run but never shared. She knew the limits. She didn't steal documents. She didn't hack anything. She simply accessed what she was authorized to see. The difference was, now, she saved everything. Her notebook filled fast. Soon, she switched to a flash drive. She scanned old emails, clipped phrases, documented inconsistencies. She wasn't planning to go public, not yet. She just wanted a record. But the truth has a gravity to it. Once you start pulling at the thread, the whole fabric begins to unravel. One night, after the office emptied, Laura stayed late under the pretense of finishing year-end compliance reports. What she actually reviewed was the internal complaint log, cases of harassment and discrimination that were closed within a week, flagged as unsubstantiated by a team led entirely by men. She recognized some of the names. Women who had disappeared quietly. Just like they wanted her to. A few days later, she received a text message from an old colleague, Samira, who had left Devlin a year prior without explanation. "Hey. Just saw your name's not on the new org chart. You okay?" Laura stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Depends on your definition of okay." Samira called her the next evening. They spoke for hours. Stories tumbled out. About Cassandra from finance who had been told her tone was the reason she didn't get promoted. About Derek from diversity and inclusion who left after his entire budget was slashed. About Greg, her current boss, being protected during an ethics review because he delivered results. It wasn't just Laura. It never was. "I'd been thinking about writing to the media," Samira confessed. "But I don't have proof. Just my word." Laura glanced at her flash drive sitting beside the tea mug on her desk. "I might," she said quietly. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a decision, even. It was a possibility. One she hadn't allowed herself to speak aloud until now. But that night, something shifted. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about the voices buried under HR reports and coded language. It was about the culture of plausible deniability that protected the powerful and silenced the rest. And Laura, who had once helped maintain that culture, was now its witness. Its archivist. Its undoing. But even then, she wasn't sure if she had the courage to go public. Not yet. She had a mortgage. Health insurance tied to her employment. A daughter in grad school. One misstep, and everything she'd worked for could disappear. That's when she remembered Sophie. An employment journalist known for her deep dives into corporate misconduct. Sophie didn't just publish stories, she protected her sources, sometimes with court battles. Laura drafted the email at 2:17 a.m. "I used to be head of HR at Devlin Co. I'm not looking for fame. I'm just tired of knowing what I know and doing nothing. If you're interested, I can show you where to look." She stared at the message for 15 minutes before pressing send. It felt like falling. But also, strangely, like standing up. That morning, Laura walked into the office as she always had. No one noticed that her face looked different. That there was a stillness to her now, not resignation, but resolve. She sat at her desk and began her day like any other. Only now, every click of her mouse, every saved file, every email she marked, was a step closer to the moment they would realize. She hadn't disappeared. She had just gone quiet. So she could listen. And when the time came, they would hear her. All of them. The article dropped on a Monday. It was published on a quiet, reputable outlet, not sensational, not clickbait, just facts. Sophie had done what she promised, cross-referenced documents, verified sources, triple-checked every quote. And when the piece finally went live, a culture of silence, inside the HR machine at Devlin & Company. It hit like a slow-burning fuse. No names were named. But everyone inside the company knew who the story was about. Within hours, the group chat lit up. Phrases like toxic leadership, HR cover-ups, pattern of silencing dissent started showing up on LinkedIn. Glassdoor reviews tripled overnight. Anonymous comments flooded internal Slack channels before they were shut down. Greg called an emergency town hall. He stood in front of a camera in a conference room too polished for apologies and gave the kind of speech people in power give when they're trying to sound like they're not in trouble. Devlin & Company takes these allegations seriously. Laura watched from home. She had called in sick. Her email inbox was overflowing, former employees thanking her, current staff cautiously reaching out, one message from a junior marketing assistant who simply wrote, "I didn't know someone was watching. Thank you." But not everyone was grateful. On Tuesday, legal requested a meeting. They hadn't traced the leak to her. Not yet. But they were circling. Questions were asked. A reminder about confidentiality clauses was issued. Laura didn't flinch. She had done her research. Weeks before, she had consulted a whistleblower protection attorney, quietly, off-record, paying in cash. Everything she'd shared was permissible under the law. No documents had been hacked. No personal data leaked. What she had exposed was culture. Pattern. Systemic neglect. And that couldn't be NDA'd into silence. By Wednesday, investors had begun asking questions. Clients were concerned. 2 internal investigations were launched. Greg was placed on temporary administrative leave. HR leadership was restructured. And still, no one knew who the source was. Because Laura hadn't spoken publicly. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that mattered, in documentation, in timelines, in the quiet, meticulous record-keeping that had once been used to dismiss people like her. Now, it was being used to protect them. Late that evening, Sophie sent her a message. "They're calling you the architect in internal threads. No one knows who you are. But they know someone inside built this case like a house of cards, and now it's collapsing." Laura didn't reply. She sat in the dark for a long time, letting the silence settle. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened her resume. Not because she needed to. Because she could. 3 weeks later, a small nonprofit called EquiWork reached out. They'd read the article. They wanted her to lead an initiative on ethical HR practices in aging workplaces. They didn't want her for damage control. They wanted her for her voice. On her first day, as she walked through the doors of her new office, no glass walls, no corner titles, just intention, she passed a mirror. For the first time in a long time, she saw someone she recognized. Not the enforcer of silence. The breaker of it. Her name was Laura Bennett. And she had rewritten the script. Not in one explosive act. But in 1,000 quiet choices that led here. To truth. To accountability. To a legacy she could finally live with. 1 year later, Laura stood at a podium, her palms resting lightly on the cool wood, facing a room full of women who looked just like her, seasoned, skeptical, and quietly brave. The conference banner behind her read, "Speaking up after 50, women, work, and whistleblowing." She hadn't planned on becoming a public figure. But sometimes, the world finds meaning in your silence before you even say a word. She adjusted her glasses and smiled gently. "People often ask me if I was angry," she began. "I wasn't. Not at first. I was tired. I was tired of being erased. Of watching people disappear quietly from workplaces that called themselves progressive. I was tired of watching bad behavior get rebranded as leadership." The room was silent. Not out of politeness, but resonance. "I didn't want to burn the place down. I wanted to open the windows. Let in the light. Let people see what they had learned to ignore." She paused, then added, "Fear isn't the enemy. Silence is." That line would later be quoted on thousands of social media posts. But in the room, it felt like a sigh of recognition. A breath held for too long, finally released. After the panel ended, a younger woman approached her, early 30s, anxious energy in her step. "I haven't spoken up yet," she said, her voice low. "But after today, I think I might." Laura didn't respond with advice. She didn't tell her what to do. She simply held the woman's gaze and said, "When you're ready, make sure you're not alone. And don't mistake your silence for safety." That night, Laura took the long way home. She didn't listen to a podcast or check her email. She just watched the world through her window, streetlights flickering, people going about their lives, unaware of how many quiet revolutions were unfolding behind office doors and computer screens. She didn't regret anything. Not the risk. Not the fear. Not even the loneliness. Because in the end, she hadn't just exposed a system. She had reminded herself, and others, that experience is not baggage. It's ballast. It keeps you steady when the storm comes. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon isn't rage or rebellion. It's a woman who knows where the bodies are buried. And decides the world deserves to know, too. Laura's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming dignity in a system that forgot what loyalty means. If you've ever felt invisible at work, or been told your time has passed, this is your reminder. Silence can be strategy. And age can be power. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed workplace injustice? Type 2 if this story inspired you. Type 7 if you've seen it happen in real life. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe to EN True Tales, where every week, we bring you powerful stories that prove it's never too late to rise.